The town was 100% underwater with the exception of one building, which was the Galley West restaurant.
I'm standing in a town that woke up to a nightmare. Times Beach, Missouri. People lost everything.
Times Beach sat along the Merrimack River, tucked off of the old Route 66. Just a couple thousand people lived there. The roads weren't paved and most people drove pickup trucks. On Sundays, kids rode bikes through the dust and neighbors waved from sagging porches. Nobody thought of it as anything special, but the truth is, Times Beach was special because it was a sitting chemical time bomb and nobody had any idea. It started with a deal from a newspaper back in 1925. The St. Louis Star-Times ran a promotion. Buy a 6-month subscription and you'd get a plot of land in a new summer resort town being developed on the river. It was supposed to be the next big getaway for city families, but when the paper shut down a few years later, so did that dream. What was left was a mostly forgotten patch of cheap land, perfect for people who couldn't afford much else. And over time, a real community eventually formed. People built trailers and modest homes. They ran small businesses and pretty much made a life there. By the 1970s, Times Beach had turned into a permanent working class town. But those unpaved roads I mentioned were becoming a serious issue. You see, every summer, clouds of dust rolled through that town, the kind that covered your screen door or coated your food if you were sitting outside. So they needed to find something to keep that dust down on the ground. And that's when a guy named Russell Bliss showed up in this equation. He ran a waste oil business out of Frontenac. It was a man with a truck, a tank, and a simple service. He would spray used oil on roads to keep the dust from kicking up. It wasn't really a new idea. Small towns and farms have been doing this for years. It was cheap, fast, and it worked. So, it was the best option they had. Bliss was hired to treat Times Beach's roads, just like he'd done in many other places. Nobody knew what was really in that tank, though. A few years earlier, Bliss had taken a separate contract, a company called Nepaco, short for Northeastern Pharmaceutical and Chemical Company. They needed to get rid of waste from their plant in Verona. They had been making hexachlorophene, which is a disinfectant that was pulled off the market after being linked to brain damage in infants. The manufacturing process left something far more dangerous behind, a chemical called TCDD, which is a type of dioxin, one of the most toxic compounds ever studied. Nepaco didn't handle disposal themselves. They passed it off to a shell company called IPC, the Independent Petrochemical Corporation. IPC then went and subcontracted this to Russell Bliss. So he mixed the chemical waste with used motor oil and sprayed it like he always did. He had to get rid of it somehow. From 1972 to 1976, Bliss sprayed roughly 160,000 gallons of contaminated oil across Missouri, on horse arenas and dirt roads everywhere. At least 27 different sites were exposed to this chemical. Times Beach was one of the largest. Nobody noticed it at first. The dust went down, and nobody really cared because, it was working. There was a strangely strong burnt and bitter smell, but people just figured that it was the oil. And then things started dying. There was a horse arena in Jefferson County where dozens of animals collapsed and had to be euthanized. Even the kids were coming down with strange rashes and fevers that just wouldn't break. In one area, chickens died off in droves within days of a spray treatment, but no official warnings were ever issued. No investigation ever came, and people just continued to live their lives. Until 1979, a journalist started digging into the horse deaths and got in touch with the Center for Disease Control. The CDC took some oil samples from the affected areas, and the results were terrifying. Some of these locations showed dioxin concentrations over 100 times what was considered hazardous. 1 part per billion was already a red flag, and these levels were at about 100. But Times Beach hadn't even been tested yet. That didn't happen until December of 1982, right after the river rose. Following weeks of rain, the Merrimack River spilled its banks and tore through Times Beach just before Christmas. The entire town was completely flooded. Families had to evacuate, and the timing couldn't have been any worse. It was the exact moment the EPA and CDC arrived to collect their samples. Times Beach had been on their list for months, but it was one of those towns known to have received Bliss spray, but now with the flood water churning through every yard and alley, the contamination was even worse. The mud itself was toxic. When the test results came back, they confirmed the worst case scenario. Some areas of Times Beach had dioxin levels nearly 300 parts per billion. That's 300 times the level considered dangerous to humans. It wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. In February of 1983, The US government made a stunning announcement. The entire town, every home, every street, every church, every school should be permanently evacuated. The town was pretty much wiped completely off the map. Some refused to even believe it, and others had nowhere to go. So the government offered buyouts. Many residents didn't trust this process. You know, this was their home. Their kids grew up there and they'd worked there their whole lives. And now they were being told by the government that the whole place was soaked in poison. But by 1985, nearly every family had already left. Over 800 homes were vacated. Times Beach was a ghost town. The federal government launched one of the most extensive environmental cleanups in US history. A massive incinerator was constructed on site, and over 265,000 tons of contaminated soil and debris were burned. The process took nearly a decade and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. In 1999, the land was officially reopened as Route 66 State Park. The only remaining structure from the original town, however, is a former roadhouse, now used as a visitor center. Inside, there are photos of what the town used to be. They even had some flyers from the buyout, which was pretty cool. And what boggles my mind the most about this story is that Russell Bliss was never criminally charged. He claimed that he had no idea what he was hauling. NEPACO was eventually dissolved. A few of its employees were held accountable under Superfund law, but the company itself pretty much just disintegrated. So nobody really paid the price for what happened to all those people at Times Beach, except the people who lived there. Some of them developed chronic illnesses, and others died without ever knowing what made them sick. Some residents still meet at reunions and share photos and talk about all the stuff that they lost. And all of this happened just because they wanted to keep the dust down, and it cost them everything. In November of 1930, a Canadian fur trapper named Joe LaBelle was making his way through the frozen wilderness near Angikuni Lake, deep in what's now known as the Canadian territory of Nunavut. The terrain there was quite unforgiving to say the least, but LaBelle wasn't really a stranger to it. He knew there was an Inuit village tucked along the lake's edge, a place that he'd passed through a couple times before. It was pretty small, you know, there was just a couple families there, but it always felt alive, and he remembered the sound of the dogs barking and the smoke coming up from the fires. It was pretty quiet, but never empty. This time, something felt wrong. Even before he reached the edge of the village, he noticed how still everything was. There was no dogs there, there was no people there, everything was gone. When he stepped into the village, that feeling only deepened a little bit more. The homes were all still intact, exactly the way he remembered them. Nothing had been disturbed, but nobody came out to greet him, which was odd because the last time he was there, everyone came out. There was no movement or sound, and he called out, and he waited and called again, but nothing. He approached the first home slowly, pulling back the covering, and stepped inside. The bedding had been neatly arranged. There was a pot that sat near the hearth. Its contents were frozen solid mid-preparation. There was no dust or decay, it was just a room that looked like it pretty much paused in time, like someone stepped out for a moment and never came back. There was a set of boots resting near the entrance, and a child's carved toy sat by a fur blanket. Everything was in its place and where it belonged, but the people. The next dwelling was kind of the same thing, and the next and the next. Each one seemed to be just waiting for people who vanished without warning to return. There was no indication or visible sign that anything bad happened here. Even the rifles were still there, propped up against the walls where they'd been after returning from a usual morning's hunt. As time passes on now with this story being told over and over again, some details have changed over time. In later years now, instead of this original rendition, some people said that the dogs were still there, tied up and frozen stiff. However, I can't find anything to verify that. There was also mention of lights in the sky that night, and some graves had been dug up and left, but none of those details appeared in the original reports from 1930. I did want to mention them to you, so just so you know about them, but what did appear was something simpler and somehow more disturbing. A trapper finding a village that had been left behind quietly without any idea of what happened to those people. So, shaken up, LaBelle traveled by foot to the nearest telegraph office and sent the word to authorities. According to newspapers, the RCMP dispatched a team to investigate. When they arrived, they reportedly confirmed everything LaBelle had described. The homes were completely untouched, and yet the RCMP today denies that it ever happened. They say they have no record of any such investigation. There's nothing in their archives mentioning a Joe LaBelle. The story, they say, is a legend, but LaBelle's name did appear in several newspapers at the time, and his descriptions remained consistent throughout the majority of them. He spoke of this village that was left in perfect order with no reason for its abandonment. So if this is just a hoax, it is a damn good convincing one. Some people now have suggested that the family simply moved on. Inuit groups were known to travel with the seasons, especially when following the caribou. But LaBelle wasn't buying that. Not because they moved or anything, because he knew that happened, but because of how they'd done it. Nobody would leave behind warm clothing or rifles, especially not in that kind of cold. And if they'd gone somewhere, they didn't leave any tracks behind. The snow surrounding the entire village was completely untouched, and that is what bothered him the most. In the years that followed the original incident, the story took on a life of its own. Magazines started adding eerie twists, and UFO theorists latched on too. Fiction blended with fact. But in those earliest articles, none of that was there. There was no flying lights or strange symbols or, any of that. It was just the village, all the people, completely gone. Historians today are completely split on it. Some think that the story is fabrication, others wonder if it really did happen and the records were simply lost, buried in time when documentation in remote northern regions were sparse and fairly unreliable. What is undeniable, though, is that something strange definitely happened and it was reported. A man told the world he'd walked into a village that looked like it'd just been abandoned mid-step, and nobody's ever proven otherwise. Angikuni Lake is still there, cold and vast like it was back then. The village, if it ever existed, however, had long been consumed by snow and ice and time and all those various other things. But for those who do know this story, there's still something about that place to me that seems a little strange. 30 people don't just disappear. Not like that anyway. On May 27th of 1962, a group of volunteer firefighters gathered at the edge of Centralia, a small coal mining town nestled in the hills of eastern Pennsylvania. They were tasked with cleaning up the town's newly established landfill, which had been placed inside an old mining pit near the Oddfellow Cemetery. The landfill was only open for a short period of time, and illegal dumping had become a serious problem. Burning trash to clear landfills wasn't exactly unheard of in other places, but it was the first time something Centralia's crews had done before at this location. Still, the town approved the plan. They lit the fire and they let it burn for a while, intending to douse it when they were done. But the problem was, it didn't really ever go out. You see, the flames reached a concealed hole in the pit's floor. It was an old unsealed mine shaft, and it slipped completely underground. They tried to smother it with dirt and then with water. They used a chemical foam, some flame retardant foam, but it kept burning. What they didn't know at the time was that the fire had slipped into a sprawling network of abandoned coal mines beneath the town. And once it found the veins of anthracite coal, it started feeding off of them, slowly but relentlessly. The fire was now completely underground, and there was no really easy way to reach it. At first, life in Centralia for most of the people there just went on. This was a tight-knit working class town of about 1,400 people. Kids played in the streets, and the churches were filled almost every Sunday. For most locals, the fire was just a strange nuance. Smoke drifting up from the ground in patches and strange smells in the air, stupid things. There was a couple sinkholes as well, I believe. They always got filled quickly. Over time, however, the signs always got harder to ignore. In the 1970s, gas stations reported their underground fuel tanks were heating up. Then came 1981. A 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski was playing in his grandmother's backyard when the ground split open beneath him. A hole about 4 feet wide and over 100 feet deep had suddenly collapsed. Todd managed to grab onto a tree root, luckily, and then thick, hot, toxic steam blasted out from the hole. He was being pulled down by loose earth when his cousin rushed over and yanked him out, just in time. Had he fallen in that, the fire likely would have taken him, or the fall. That incident made national news. And then, suddenly, Centralia wasn't just this weird little town with a fire problem, it was a horrible threat. A place where the earth could literally open up at any point and just swallow you whole. At least it's what everyone thought. So, investigators arrived, geologists were drilling test holes, and they confirmed that the fire traveled more than 3 miles since it started and was still spreading. This was not good. In 1983, the US government allocated $42 million for relocation. It wasn't technically a forced evacuation, but the warning was fairly clear. The town wasn't really safe anymore, so you might as well take your money and move on. Over the next few years, hundreds of families accepted this buyout and moved to nearby communities. But not everybody left. Some residents insisted the danger was exaggerated. They said the state was using scare tactics to seize valuable mineral rights, and they refused to let go. Legal battles followed, and a few people actually won the right to stay, at least temporarily. But by the 1990s, almost all of Centralia was gone. In 1992, Pennsylvania invoked eminent domain and claimed all the properties. In 2002, the U.S. Postal Service revoked Centralia's zip code, and by 2009, the state formally condemned the last remaining houses. 7 residents refused to leave and filed one final lawsuit, and they did reach a deal. They could stay for the rest of their lives, but their homes would be demolished after they passed away. Today, Centralia is a complete ghost town. Most of the streets there still exist, but they lead to empty lots. A few rusting street signs are there as well. From what I hear, if you walk along the roads in the winter, you can still see steam coming up from the frozen ground. And that fire is still burning today, and it will be tomorrow, and experts say that it could keep going for another 250 years, maybe even more. If you go there, you won't see open flames, but the heat is still there. Now, I went there and I didn't feel the heat, but you can definitely still smell a bit of smoke. Plenty of people still visit this place. I mean, urban explorers and YouTubers, some come for the ghost town atmosphere and others come for the legend that I haven't got into yet. I actually went there myself a couple years ago as a huge fan of Silent Hill. Hearing all the claims that Centralia was the real-life Silent Hill really had me interested to go see what it was all about. Now, a lot of you may have played Silent Hill and some of you may not have. I certainly did. So we made the drive expecting to see this awesome place, and there's also this highway there that was completely covered in graffiti, but we found out by the time we got there that it had been completely buried. That was a bit of a letdown, but still, being there was just pretty cool, I guess. It was a bit creepy and eerie, and I took some pictures, so here's a couple of them. They're not really great or anything, but I think they're pretty cool. The graffiti highway used to be the most iconic part of Centralia. It was an old stretch of Route 61 that had warped and cracked from the fire underneath it. So, over the years, it turned into this massive spray-painted mural covered in slogans and art, all that kind of, just graffiti. But in April of 2022, the landowners brought in truckloads of dirt and completely buried it to keep trespassers away. I am very disappointed in this decision. Let me see it. If you did enjoy, please hit that subscribe button and maybe give this video a thumbs up, as I am trying to transition into long form video and I'd really appreciate the help. And if you want to support the channel, you can head over to our Patreon. The link should be in the description. It is also somewhere on the YouTube homepage thing, but anyway, you get the idea. So yeah, have a good night. Bye-bye.